The air inside the old monastery seemed heavy that summer, as if the walls themselves were warning of something coming. At first, no one understood why the monks kept glancing down the halls, or why servants whispered with their hands over their mouths. Then the smell arrived slow at first, then stronger, until it moved like a living thing through every corridor. It wasn't the odor of a dead animal, or even a battlefield left to rot. This smell was worse because it came from someone still alive. A man whose name once shook entire kingdoms. A king who had crossed seas, burned cities, and taken a crown by force. William the Conqueror, the ruler who had rebuilt England with blood and iron, was now being eaten from the inside while his heart still struggled to beat. People who had once bowed to him now stepped back in horror. His breath rattled, his skin darkened, and the stench rolling off his body became so thick that candles flickered when he exhaled. Chroniclers would later say that even death seemed afraid to come near him. But this story does not begin in that dark room. It began weeks earlier, with one sudden accident that changed everything. In the heat of that summer, far from the quiet halls where he would eventually collapse. William was still trying to prove he was the same unstoppable force he had always been. He was 59, aging but still fierce, directing an attack on the French town of Mantes. The whole campaign came from wounded pride, a spark lit by an insult he could not forgive. King Philip of France had mocked William's growing size, joking that the Conqueror looked like a pregnant woman. For a man who had built his life on strength, discipline, and fear, the insult was more painful than any wound. William swore he would answer the humiliation with fire, not words. Mantes would burn as payback, proof that no one could laugh at him without facing consequences. His armies surrounded the town and set it ablaze. Houses, churches, and streets vanished into walls of flame. Smoke twisted into the sky while the screams of the townspeople echoed between collapsing buildings. William rode through the burning ruins on his warhorse, his armor glowing in the heat. For him, this was not cruelty, but confirmation that he was still powerful, still dangerous. But fate was already waiting for him in the ashes. When you are ready, say, as William guided his horse across the smoking ruins. The moment that would destroy him arrived without warning. The animal suddenly reared, jolting upward with violent force. Some later said burning debris had scorched its hooves. Others believed a nearby wall collapsed, startling it. Whatever the cause, the great horse rose high, and William's heavy body pitched forward. He slammed hard into the iron pommel of his saddle. The blow drove deep into his swollen abdomen. No blood showed, no cut appeared, but something inside him tore in a way no one could see. The pain was so sharp that William folded over, gasping, clutching his stomach as if trying to hold himself together. His attendants rushed to steady him and hurried him away from the flames. His physicians examined him quickly, but they found nothing on the surface, no wound, no bruise, no opening for them to treat. Yet William felt it clearly. Something had broken deep inside. A slow, spreading sickness had begun, something he could not fight with strength or anger still. He refused to admit weakness. He ordered his men to take him to Rouen, to the priory of St. Gervais, believing he could recover there. But every mile of the journey grew more unbearable. The road to ruin felt endless. William was carried in a litter, and every small bump, every shift of weight, sent a fresh wave of agony tearing through his gut. His attendants tried to walk slowly, but even the gentlest motion made him clench his teeth and squeeze his eyes shut. By the time they reached the monastery, sweat soaked his clothes, and his face had turned grey from pain. The physicians who arrived rushed to help him, but medieval medicine had no way to understand the invisible disaster happening inside his body. They tried everything they knew: bleeding, poultices, hot compresses, herbs, whispered prayers, even attempts to calm his spirit, but nothing eased the spreading sickness. Within days, his condition worsened in ways that terrified even the monks. His stomach began to swell, growing larger and tighter every morning. It looked as if something inside him was inflating, pushing outward against his skin. The saddle strike had likely torn organs and allowed poison from his intestines to leak into places it never should have been. Infection grew quickly, moving through his abdomen like a fire inside a sealed chamber. His skin slowly changed color, turning from flushed red to deep purple, then almost black in patches. Each change signaled another part of his body dying from the inside. And then came the smell. At first, it was faint, like spoiled food, but soon it thickened into a foul, heavy stench that clung to everything it touched. Servants gagged as they entered his room. Monks could hardly finish their prayers before rushing outside for air. The odor was unmistakable, the smell of rotting flesh from a man who was still alive. It drifted down the halls, settled into corners, and spread through the entire wing of the monastery until no one could escape it. Some attendants refused to return, choosing punishment over the unbearable task of staying near him. William felt himself slipping. His powerful body, once capable of crossing seas and destroying kingdoms, was collapsing piece by piece. He tried to stay conscious, tried to hold on to the dignity he had commanded his entire life. But the pain was relentless. Fever blurred his thoughts. His once strong voice cracked. His breath came in short, desperate bursts. Even then, the infection kept eating through muscle and tissue, uncaring that it belonged to a king. His face hollowed. His eyes sank deep into darkened sockets. His skin grew cold and mottled, the color of storm clouds. Medieval chroniclers later wrote that his screams echoed through the monastery, that the sound was so raw and filled with misery that even hardened warriors felt shaken hearing it. William begged for mercy not from any enemy, but from God himself. He asked for release from the agony tearing him apart. But the physical torment was only part of the suffering. A deeper, quieter pain gnawed at him. William had lived his whole life proving he was stronger than anyone who challenged him. He had been mocked as a child for being born illegitimate, and he answered by conquering Normandy. He defeated rivals, crushed rebellions, and took England by force. He ruled with fire, fear, and unbreakable determination. Strength had always been his shield. Now, that shield had shattered. His own body bloated, infected. Decaying while he still breathed had become his final enemy. No army, no fortress, no crown could save him. And he understood the bitter truth. This battle could not be won. As the days dragged on, the infection took more than William's strength. It took the people round him. Servants who had cared for him faithfully for years began to avoid his chamber. Some entered only long enough to place food near his bed before fleeing with their sleeves pressed over their noses. Others openly refused to continue, saying they would rather face punishment than breathe the air in that room again. The king who once commanded armies now could not convince a servant to stand beside him. The smell rolling off his rotting body was simply too powerful, too unnatural, almost as if death had moved in early and taken over the room. But abandonment inside the monastery was not the worst of it. Once word spread beyond the walls that William was failing, opportunists began to gather. His chamber still held treasures collected over decades of war gold, fine cloth, sacred relics, and gifts from across Europe. These objects had once symbolized his triumphs. Now they tempted those who sensed his power slipping away. At first, a few quiet hands reached for whatever they could hide beneath their cloaks. Then, when it became clear no one was truly guarding the dying king's possessions, the stealing grew bold. Servants, soldiers, even nobles who had come pretending to pay respects slipped into his chamber only to snatch whatever valuables they could carry. They shielded their faces from the suffocating stench as they stole, but they stole all the same. And William saw them. In his rare moments of clarity, his fading eyes followed the figures moving in his room. People who had once bowed to him now rummaged through his belongings while he lay helpless, unable to lift a hand to stop them. Chronicler Audric Vitalis later described the scene with disbelief. Men who had once trembled at the king's presence now stepped over his decaying body to grab treasures, whispering and laughing as they divided what they took. Even in a century known for brutality, this open disrespect shocked observers. It was complete humiliation. The king who once shaped nations with fire and steel now could not protect his own chamber from thieves. Even the priests who came to comfort him struggled to stay. William had always shown deep loyalty to the church, giving land, building monasteries, and seeking absolution for his sins. Now, with death close, he wanted forgiveness more than anything. He confessed his memories of war, the villages destroyed, the uprisings crushed, the people forced to bend to his will. He spoke of his strained bond with his eldest son, Robert, and named his plans for inheritance: Normandy to Robert, England to William Rufus, money to Henry. But even while listening to his final wishes, the priests hurried through their prayers, shaken by the heavy, choking odor of decay around them. Some rushed out as soon as they finished their blessings, gasping for clean air in the hall. Meanwhile, his body continued its terrifying transformation. The swelling in his abdomen grew larger each day, stretching his skin so tightly it looked as if it might split. The discoloration spread dark and wide across his torso. The smell thickened until it reached the courtyard outside the building. Birds avoided that side of the monastery. The very air seemed poisoned. On September 9th, as dawn bells rang through when William stirred for the last time, he raised his trembling hands toward the ceiling, whispered a few broken words, and let out a final breath. After weeks of agony, the Conqueror finally slipped into stillness. But the horror of his story did not end with his death. The moment he died, the last servant who had stayed with him ran from the room. Others who had lingered nearby took the chance to escape as well, leaving his body alone in the stifling heat. Hours passed with no one willing to approach him. His corpse, already far into decomposition, lay abandoned on the bed where he died. Most of his treasures had been looted. The room smelled so powerfully of death that even the boldest attendants hesitated to enter. And while messengers were sent and nobles argued about funeral plans, William's body continued to rot untouched, unwashed, and unguarded. When attendants finally returned to William's chamber, the sight stunned them. His body had continued to break down in the heat, the skin softening and the swollen abdomen stretching even further. The odor was so extreme that the men who came to prepare his corpse stepped back instantly, covering their mouths and shaking their heads. Traditional embalming was impossible. They knew they could not drain, clean, or treat a body that had already begun to come apart. Some refused outright, saying no amount of money could make them stand in that room for longer than a few moments. But William had left clear instructions. He wanted to be buried in calm. In the Abbey of Saint Etienne, a grand church he had founded himself, someone had to move the corpse. Eventually, a minor knight named Herluin agreed to take charge. Pushed by duty and the promise of a reward, he and a few others wrapped the body roughly in linen, soaking the cloth with wine and packing it with spices. These were desperate attempts to slow the decay, though none of them worked well. Those who handled the body whispered that the flesh sagged under their hands, softening like overripe fruit. Even touching the king felt wrong, as if he might fall apart at any moment. They placed him in a lead-lined coffin, hoping the metal would trap the odor and hold the shape of the corpse. The lid was hammered shut quickly, and preparations began for the journey to come. What should have been a solemn royal procession immediately became something else. As the wagon rolled through Normandy, people who gathered to watch gagged and stepped backward. Some threw flowers toward the coffin not from mourning, but to mask the scent drifting from the tiny gaps in the lead. Dogs came close, sniffed, and then ran away howling. Even the horses pulling the cart snorted and tried to turn their heads. From the smell pushing into the air when they finally reached Caen, another disaster struck. A fire had broken out in the town, blocking the path. The funeral convoy had to wait outside the walls for hours, while the flames were brought under control. The late summer heat beat down on the sealed coffin and inside. The gases of decomposition built up more pressure. No one knew how dangerously unstable the body had become. All they knew was that the smell leaking from the seams was growing stronger by the minute. When the city finally opened its gates, nobles, priests, and curious townspeople gathered inside the abbey to witness the burial of the great Conqueror. The church glowed with candles, and William's stone tomb waited at the front, carved years earlier when he was slimmer and healthier. Rumors of the king's condition had already spread, but tradition demanded attendance. So the abbey filled with people trying to look solemn while quietly covering their faces. But dignity was impossible. As the pallbearers carried the coffin through the nave, a foul odor seeped into the air, drifting through the rows of people. Some tried to breathe through their sleeves, Others bent their heads in discomfort. Still, the priests began chanting the funeral rites, their voices shaking as the stench thickened around them. Then came the moment everything went wrong. The pallbearers lifted the lid to move the body into the stone tomb. The instant the coffin opened, a blast of trapped gases burst out with explosive force. The smell hit the crowd like a physical blow. People cried out, stumbled backward, or dropped to their knees trying not to vomit. The priests paused mid-prayer, their faces pale. Some of the congregation ran toward the doors, desperate to escape the unbearable odor. Yet even as panic spread, the attendants continued their work. They lifted the wrapped corpse and tried to lower it into the sarcophagus. That's when they discovered a terrible problem. The tomb was too small. William's body, swollen by death and decomposition, simply would not fit. They tried turning him, pushing him, adjusting the angle, but nothing worked. The priests begged them to continue. Sweat dripped from the pallbearers' faces as they pushed harder, trying to press his swollen abdomen beneath the stone rim. And that was when the horror reached its peak. William's belly burst. The ruptured abdomen released a violent spray of decaying fluids and gas, filling the air with a stench so thick that chroniclers wrote it felt almost solid. People screamed. Others collapsed. Many ran for their lives. Even the priests fled the altar, abandoning the ceremony halfway through. Only a few brave attendants stayed behind, forcing what remained of William's body into the tomb. They sealed it as quickly as they could, desperate to trap the smell and end the nightmare. The funeral of England's first Norman king had become a scene of chaos, nausea, and terror. Nothing close to honor, nothing close to respect. The story of the exploding corpse spread quickly through Normandy and England. People whispered about it in markets, monks repeated it in monasteries, and nobles carried the tale across their lands. In a world where burial rituals were sacred, William's funeral was seen as a terrible sign. Many believed God had judged him, letting his body decay in such a shocking way to reveal the weight of his sins. Priests used the event in sermons, saying that even kings could not escape punishment for pride, violence, and cruelty. The chaos of the funeral also matched the chaos that followed his death. William's sons immediately fell into rivalry. Robert claimed Normandy, William Rufus took England, and Henry held little more than money. His empire, once united by force, began to split apart almost at the moment of his burial. Even his tomb did not remain peaceful. Over the centuries, it was opened, damaged, and destroyed. Wars and religious conflict tore through Con, and most of William's remains were lost forever. Only a single thigh bone survived, later placed inside a new tomb. The rest of him vanished, as if history itself refused to let his body rest. With modern medical understanding, the mystery behind William's horrifying death becomes much clearer. The blow from the saddle likely tore deep inside his abdomen, damaging his intestines or nearby organs. Even though no blood appeared on the outside, the injury allowed dangerous bacteria from his gut to spill into the inner cavity. This would cause peritonitis, a severe infection that spreads fast and is almost always deadly without treatment. His swelling, the discoloration of his skin, and the unbearable smell all match what doctors now know happens When infection destroys tissue from the inside, gas-producing bacteria filled his abdomen, stretching it like a sealed container ready to explode. His obesity made everything worse by slowing blood flow and giving the infection more space to grow. In today's world, surgeons could have saved him with an operation and antibiotics. But in 1087, no one understood internal injuries, and there were no tools to fight infection. From the moment the saddle struck him, his fate was already fixed. William did not just die in terrible pain, he died stripped of power, dignity, and control. The king who once shaped nations was reduced to a decaying body people were afraid to touch. His final moments became a symbol of how quickly greatness can fall. William's legacy became a story of two very different truths. One truth is the powerful ruler who crossed the sea, reshaped England, and built systems that survived long after his lifetime. The other truth is the shocking end. He could not escape the rotting body, the panicked funeral, the tomb too small to contain him. Chroniclers wrote about his death with the same care they used when describing his victories, because both moments revealed something important. His life showed how far strength and determination could take a man. His death showed how quickly the human body can betray even the strongest ruler. People remembered the king who conquered a kingdom, but they also remembered how he lost his final battle to an unseen wound. The image of William's swollen body bursting before a horrified crowd stayed alive for centuries, told again and again as a warning about pride, power, and the limits of human control. In the end, the man who built an empire was undone by something simpler tear inside his abdomen that no one could see. His story endures because it captures both the rise and the fall, the glory and the fear, the strength and the helplessness that define every human life. And before you go, I want to hear from you. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels.